We have to do things differently today. The countdown is not appearing on my screen at all. Oh man. Okay, well we'll you know what we'll do? We'll pretend there's a countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, oh whatever. Hey everybody, welcome to RealAg Live. Thanks for joining us here today. I really appreciate it. Hope you had yourselves a great weekend, and we're going to have a lot of fun today talking about a very important topic, especially with the prices out there. We got to make sure we get our canola off to a great start. If you want to participate in today's discussion, all you have to do is enter your question or comment in the box, whether you're watching on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook. And we're going to have a great program here for you today. This is a live show. It's not some pre-recorded webinar that Warren and I did last week, and now we're going to fake it, and then I'm going to bring him in, and you can ask him questions. It's live for the entire show. We'll be here for the next 30 minutes, and I appreciate you joining us here today. Let's bring in today's guest. It is Warren Ward. He is with the Canola Council of Canada, based out of, I think it's Yorkton, Saskatchewan, right, Warren?
Yeah, in the Yorkton area, you bet.
Nice. How are conditions looking there?
I think it's very similar to a lot of places on the prairies right now. The snow is disappearing, and the dryness is starting to show up. So, it's going to be an interesting spring, just given where we ended last fall, and maybe the snow amount we had over winter. It's going to be a fun one.
There's some challenges out there. Not the canola markets, but the canola agronomic side of the equation. You can't go to a lot of areas that aren't like if there are areas where there is adequate moisture and they're like, you know what, I think we're going to be okay. We'll get started. But there's a large amount of the prairies right now that are really, really, and in their own definition, everybody's dry or a drought is different. But a lot of people talking about how dry it is. It's a real concern heading into spring here.
Yeah, I actually just saw a soil moisture map this morning, and there was a lot of red on it. It was, it's a little bit unsettling when you see that at this time of year. So, that being said, it is still March, and there's still a lot of time for conditions to change. But yeah, definitely looking on the drier side so far.
So, because it is so dry, how does that impact your seeding, your decisions you make at this here in the spring? Weed control, I think, is the first one that comes to mind in terms of we know we have to have a clean start. We want that crop to be as competitive as possible, and those weeds that come up at the same time as the crop are very, very pesky. So, weed control when there's no weeds because it's dry is definitely something that a bit of a wrench in the spoke, so to speak.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a consideration for a lot of people this year, I think, because of the drier conditions. And it does look like we're heading into an earlier spring right now as well. So maybe there's going to be the opportunity to get on the fields earlier than people would normally expect to, and maybe get some seed in the ground earlier than would be average. So, yeah, some considerations there. Number one, maybe it's early and the weeds don't seem to be growing. Plus, if it's a little dry on the drier side, those weeds probably aren't going to be growing as well. So we're maybe even the last few years, you get those cool springs, and it doesn't seem like there's a weed growth prior to seeding. And a lot of people were skipping their pre-seed burn, and so that does come along with some challenges too, because we do know those early weeds are the ones that are going to give you the most competition in terms of fighting for resources and impacting your yield, right? So we do want to make sure we're keeping on top of them, even if we are in the field early and we're not seeing them prior to that that seeding operation.
Now, if I do skip the pre-seed burn down and I go with sort of a more pre-emerge weed control strategy, boy, my first application, whether that's Roundup or Liberty or whatever have you, it needs to be early, like as early as possible to get those weeds out of there as soon as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And even maybe to back it up a step, people, if they are thinking of skipping that pre-seed burn, maybe go out and do a really accurate assessment of what's happening in the fields before you actually skip that operation. Because a lot of times, you do the quick drive-by and it looks like there's nothing happening in the field. But if you go out there and you start scratching around a little bit, maybe there's some seedlings that are coming that are, quite small and really hard to see without, being right up close to them. But those are the ones that we do want to control early on. and not to mention the perennials that will be out there. Getting an early control on them is going to be most effective as well. But if you do have to or end up skipping that pre-seed opportunity, yeah, that first in crop application is very timely. And some people might try and come in and do a pre-emergent burn off as well, and that's one that you really got to be careful with, because depending on your conditions, if those plants are starting to pop out of the ground a little early, depending what you're using for control, you don't want to be damaging any of those early emerging seedlings either.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, definitely, if we're looking at that first in crop application, earlier is always better than later.
That's a really, really small window, right? When you especially if things turn where, especially if you get a bit of a rainstorm, something comes in for moisture. We're never going to turn back moisture, but that window can close very, very quickly if your intent is to do a burn down post seeding. It can be
Absolutely.
really, really. You need to get out of your truck, get into the field, and have a look.
Yeah, and having a plan B for that situation, right? That might be your plan A, but like you say, if things kind of go a little bit sideways or you don't get out there quite when you were planning to, have that first in crop application in your back pocket just in case you need to switch to that one instead.
What about seeding depth? What are some of the best practices regarding seeding depth when it comes to canola?
So we're talking about seeding depth in March. So we've also been talking about that it's dry. I'm not going to say we should be chasing moisture at this stage in the game, because a lot can happen between now and seeding and after seeding. Typically, though, when we do see dry conditions, the discussion always is, how deep can I seed my canola? How far can I chase the moisture? And there definitely are limits as to how deep you're going to chase that. Typically, we're saying half an inch to maybe an inch deep would be your ideal depth for canola. As we get into these drier conditions, or assuming it is drier at seeding, pushing it past that inch is where the risk starts happening. Yeah, there's reward there, but there's also risk. So how far are we going to push it? We're certainly not saying anywhere near 2 inches or anything like that, because that that has its own challenges. Looking at inch and a quarter, especially if it's early on in the season, I'm not going to want to see people going much deeper than that, just because of the possibility for some moisture to get that crop going. Now, if we were talking later in the spring, in a late seeding situation, then the conversation might change a little bit. But keep in mind the soil conditions or soil types as well, too, right? If we're seeding into a heavier clay soil, that deeper seeding could have more impact on seed survivability than seeding into a lighter textured soil that's a little easier to push through. So there's a lot of considerations that go into that.
Yeah. Especially with, like you mentioned, like the soil condition or the soil type is important, especially if you're more prone to crusting and things like that. You don't want to get that seedling trapped below the soil surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And even packing pressure can play a role in that as well.
Yeah, for sure. What about in terms of the soil being fit? How do you, as an agronomist, define what fit soil is, when you should actually go? How do you look at that?
Well, there's probably two answers to that one, Shaun. There's the textbook answer, and then there's the real world answer. And so really, if we want to look at the textbook answer, we want that soil to be nice and warm and moist, and that's perfect seeding conditions. That's not necessarily always going to happen, but if we're looking at that 8 to 10 degrees Celsius with good moisture at seeding depth, that's going to give canola a really good opportunity to germinate and establish. If we were to look at, okay, logistics play a role and time of year play a role. If we're looking at an earlier seeding scenario, which is maybe on a lot of people's minds right now, I would look at probably, soil temperature, but soil moisture is going to be important as well. But also keep in mind, maybe it's not so much a soil factor, it's more an environmental factor. When's your last fall or spring frost date typically? And we really want to keep that one in mind, because the earlier we go, there's going to be a lot of, say we do establish that field in good time, let's say like a late April or something like that. And, we've normally would be in the second week of May, we've increased that risk of frost damage on that crop quite a bit as well. So, maybe to turn it back to your what is the best soil to go into, it's going to really vary, I think, from one area to another. We want that soil to be as warm as possible, is the long and the short of it, and realizing that a lot of people are going to start seeding, when that soil is still quite cold. And
Yeah.
if you've got a lot of acres to cover, there's sometimes not a lot of ways around that. But keep in mind, if we're going into cold soils, it's going to take a lot longer for that crop to emerge from those as well. So sometimes waiting a little bit for that soil to warm up versus going in early when it's colder, you might see emergence be very similar between those two scenarios.
Is there a risk mitigation strategy there? If you are going to go early and you are worried about that frost date in the spring, heavy up the seeding rate? Does that help at all?
I certainly wouldn't be cutting seeding rates if we're going into less than ideal conditions. You can, if a person has the opportunity to look at the canola calculator and go through some of the scenarios on there in terms of, seed size and what your expected seed mortality is, you can really start to play around with what you want for a plant stand and look at some of your seeding rate options to get there. Would we want to see a higher seeding rate? Not in every scenario, right? It's going to be, if you expect that field to establish really well, we don't want to have an excess of plants in it either. So it is a bit of a guessing game, but that's really why we encourage plant counts. And doing plant counts this year is good for the conditions that were of this year, right? If we've been doing plant counts for the last 10 years, we've maybe seen years that we seeded into cooler soils or drier soils. And then we can say, okay, on those years we were at, X% seed survivability versus other years when we've been higher or lower. So, it is a good practice to get into for that long-term numbers game of knowing what to expect on some of these different years.
So say I'm short of moisture. We know that having an even emergence is critical, right? So there's the viable plant stand, the ideal plant stand we're looking for from a population standpoint. But then there's also the fact it's all emerged evenly. And we've seen in other crops, corn is an example, we're hearing a lot about this, where you really want that field that you've planted to just come out all at the same time. When you have really, really variable conditions, that becomes really a lot more difficult on your seeding strategy here. Some may say, hey, you know what? Forget about the early seeding. I'm going to just hold out and wait for maybe a little bit of spring moisture and give myself a bit of a chance and not hurt my yield if this crop comes up so unevenly. Is that a thing that you think's rolling through a lot of people's heads?
It could be, certain times I have heard where people will say, okay, that's it. I'm not seeing any more canola now until we get some moisture. And then if we get it in time, I'll go continue seeding. Is it a strategy you would want to consider on all of your acres? Probably not. Maybe splitting some of that risk up and getting out there on the fields early, seed a portion of your acres, maybe wait a little while and come back at your more normal or traditional time and doing some fields at that time as well could be a good risk mitigation strategy, right? Because let's face it, we can't seem to predict the weather really well, and what's happening today isn't necessarily what's going to be happening 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, for sure. Lindsay has a question here because this is a strategy we've heard about from a few people because there's such a big gap between the old crop and new crop prices. They're going to seed super early and try to harvest in the old crop. If I was going to try that and do a super early harvest on canola, is there anything I can do to plant a really short season variety? Maybe.
Yeah, I suppose that's an option. Really isn't one that I had considered. But if we're looking at being in the field early, maybe it is an opportunity for some people. Again, getting that plant off to a good start is going to be key, though. Typically we look at our target plant density of being 5 to 8 plants per square foot. If we're trying to target early maturity, we're going to want to be at the higher end of that rather than the lower end of that. Even things like you were talking about the consistency across a field in terms of your plant density. We see a lot of benefit from having. So we say that 5 to 8 plants is what we want. We can go lower than that and still have a really good yield as long as those plants are consistent across the field. But again, the lower our plant densities, the more branching, the longer flowering is going to extend, the longer that maturity is going to take. So it could be a risky strategy, I guess, to bank everything on that early establishment. But yeah, I mean, with adequate fertility, good plant stand, if it happens to get off to a good start, maybe there is some opportunity there.
This is a year where, boy, it would have been nice to plant our winter canola. If they could survive our Canadian winters, because that would put you in the ideal harvest window when it comes to old crop.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, we're working with different conditions than anywhere else that's growing winter canola.
Yeah. Have you seen any more research at all in your travels at the Canola Council? Is there hardier winter canolas coming? Like we see it a lot in the PNW. We see winters in, of course, Ontario, but those winters are different than the prairies.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's not a lot of work going into that right now, and every once in a while there is some questions or some interest on it. But really, I think the heart of it is that our winters, like you say, they're just too harsh, and every once in a while somebody will get a notion to try it, and usually they'll try it with very limited success, and then that'll be the last we hear of it again for another few years.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Any thoughts at all on fertilizer in the spring strategies? Obviously, the price is up there. We've established
Yeah,
that. But how about from an application standpoint?
sure. Lots of thoughts there. So, you know, having a good fertility plan, especially on a year like coming into a potentially drier year, is really key in my mind. A lot of people are going to have a plan in place, probably one that they started on last fall. Maybe you've purchased some of your fertilizer already, hopefully, and if not, then well, that's definitely going to be something you're going to want to look into here very soon. But it really does. It is a planning process that begins well before seeding, and I like to think it starts kind of at the end of harvest last year, and hopefully people have had the opportunity to go out and do some soil sampling, coming off of the years where we've had a lot of variability in terms of yield, right? So what's happening in those fields? Are we at a depleted fertility situation in those fields, or is there a little bit more there than we would typically expect because yields were lower? The good place to start with that is that soil test, just to see what we're working with. Coming into this year, though, we've got a plan in place. I think we just need to keep in mind that a good plan is one that we review and have some flexibility with too. If we are going into a drier situation, I'd really want to be cautious about seed placed fertilizer. We know we're going to see some benefit from having some phosphorus in the seed row. And if it's dry conditions, we're going to want to make sure we're really not pushing those limits on how much is in that seed row. So, typically if we're looking at 15 to 20 or 25 pounds of phos in the seed row, we might want to be dialing that back to the lower end of the range this year. And for the other nutrients, we want to get them out of that seed row if possible. I know a lot of people do try and push the boundaries a little bit and have a little bit a few other nutrients other than phosphorus in the seed row, but there's a lot of challenges with that, or danger, I guess. And some years we're going to be able to get away with that. This may not be the year if we're going into drier soils, and what you've gotten away with in the past isn't always what you're going to be able to get away with today.
Mm. Yeah, the dryness does pose some real challenges and consideration when it comes to that seed placed fertilizer. You can't, that's where last year's conditions, the year before's conditions, and this worked really, really well. You got to be careful when it comes to the spring of 21 based on some of that dryness.
Yeah, I saw that a few years ago, actually, where we'd been coming off a number of really wet years and people really had been pushing boundaries with what they were applying and where they were applying it in terms of fertilizer, a lot of it in the seed row. And all of a sudden we got a drier spring. And boy, right away, there was a lot of issues where crop wasn't emerging. And, there's probably a lot of factors at play as to why that was happening. But definitely one of them was we were just pushing that seed placed fertilizer way beyond where it should be. But the dryness, it's going to have some rate implications too for some people when it comes to fertilizer. And we've got let's say we've got a yield target in mind. Is that still an adequate target to have if we're looking at drier conditions? A lot of people will maybe think about cutting their fertilizer rates on a year like this. I really like to caution people with that one though. We've seen it in the past where we've got a drier spring and early summer, but then the rains pick up later on in the season, and canola being the plant that it is, it really is able to capitalize on that. And if we don't have that fertilizer in place, when the conditions do improve, there's really no way to capitalize on that extra moisture. So having that flexible plan where, okay, maybe you are concerned about the conditions this spring, and you do feel like you don't want to push things too far, that's fine. But let's have a plan in place where maybe we come in and do some top dressing in season if we think things are starting to improve. So definitely having some flexibility in that fertilizer plan is important. And we like to talk about the 4 R's of nutrient management, right? And the right rate is really an important one for us in terms of how are we determining those rates. Hopefully we're using those soil tests, and are we changing them from one field to another? I mean, we talk about variability. There's a lot of fields, especially I'm in eastern Saskatchewan here, where you want to see variability. You can see 3 or 4 different areas in about 10 steps through a field, I think. So, we have to really be ready to manage each individual field appropriately, especially on some of these years where we're going to have some differences based on what that field's capable of doing on going into a drier year.
Yeah, on it, like the scenario you just talked about, how the year changes, right? I think it was 2019, I believe, where it was dry. The crop looks terrible. End of June, early July came, and we all of a sudden had all this rain. We worked our way back to average, and people were kind of scrambling. I remember that year, some people were talking about not even doing in-crop weed control because they thought it didn't make sense. So your point is very, very valid. I just want to jump back. Really, a question I forgot to ask when we were talking about weed control is if somebody had put down, say, fall edge, they need that fertilizer to activate. That's got to be something we got to be thinking about this spring too. Is some of these products that require moisture to activate, right? Residuals.
Yeah, I think in terms of activating most of those, I mean, if those herbicides that have been applied haven't activated, we've probably got bigger problems than weed control.
Okay.
But there's generally going to be enough moisture in the system to get those going. Where it can be more of an issue actually is when we've got these dry conditions and we start talking about herbicide carryover from other crops previous years, and that can also be a really a significant concern for people when we're talking about canola, right? Some of those group 2 products do tend to hang around in the soil, especially in those drier conditions. And I know a few years ago when we had some of those drier springs, that definitely there were some concerns and some issues around that. So yeah, definitely when we want to look at rotations, keep an eye on that and look at what your past herbicide use has been, probably more so than the activity of this year's herbicides, I think.
Okay. So do you think that carryover will be a problem then for 21?
I haven't really seen too much information on that people are expecting it to be, and again, it does depend a lot on the moisture conditions last year. But certainly, if you were below average in terms of moisture last year, then that could be something you would want to be looking into at the very least.
Well, you're in Yorkton, and that's one of the areas where I've talked to growers every week on the Farmer Rapid Fire on our Sirius XM show. And I've heard different farmers predict, like that whole band there, it's going to be wall-to-wall canola. It's going to be interesting to see how rotations sort of, in some cases, get thrown out the window in a year like this.
Yeah, I wonder if that's actually really going to happen though, because if we're basing it on economics and crop prices, I mean, there's other crops that are doing quite well right now too, and I know canola is quite lucrative for most people, but I think there's something to be said for that rotation, and then not everybody is maybe following the best rotation out there, but I think that is starting to change. When we start seeing diseases like Clubroot that are basically that Clubroot map has spread quite vastly across the prairies, right? So, but I think when people really start looking at what the risk is from really tightening those rotations up, I think we are starting to see some progress there. But you're right. I mean, we know canola rotations have been tight, and they've been tight for a long time. And, I guess if that is the case, it really does increase the level of management that we need to be doing on those acres.
Yeah, one of the management techniques, of course, or strategies is planting a clubroot variety. If obviously if you're in an area where clubroot is a concern or it's prevalent, planting a clubroot variety is a great idea. What about if you're in an area where it's not necessarily showing up on the clubroot map? Should you still be planting a clubroot variety?
Take on that at the Canola Council is that yes, you should. And the reason for that is just because you're not in a red zone on the club root's not in your area. So until you see it and have those issues, you may not realize it's there and that it can be a problem. So from that standpoint, there's no risk to growing a clubroot variety, resistant variety, before you see clubroot showing up in your area. It's kind of preventative medicine in those scenarios. But back to the rotation comment, when we start talking about clubroot resistance, that's really one of the areas that we do need to be careful of. That when we do start using these resistant varieties, that we do also follow those rotation messages, because we don't want to see that loss of resistance just by pushing those rotations and thinking, okay, there's always going to be another clubroot resistant variety, because there may come a day when there isn't, and we do really need to be careful with that.
Yeah, the use of the clubroot trait, in a variety doesn't doesn't replace the proper crop rotation strategy. Those two things are used as tools together, not
Right.
mutually exclusive of each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question earlier from Brian: is the Canola Council still working on its 25 million metric tons by 2025? Is that still the yield target?
Yeah. So, and again, that's maybe a little different than the previous yield targets that we had at the Canola Council. In the past, we were always looking at that, metric ton. How many, 50 million metric tons was one of the last ones. Now we've shifted gears. So we still have a metric ton goal, but really we're looking at not driving that increased production by more acres. We want to see more bushels per acre to get to these targets now, because we just finished talking about it. Rotations are probably as tight as they can be. There's really no more acres in most areas anyway that can come into play. So we're not going to reach that goal by growing canola on more acres. It's really going to be by increasing the management on the acres that we are growing canola on. And so yeah, we're still our target still is for that 52 bushels per acre on average by the year 2025. So we've got a little ways to go on that one too. We early on we had some gains there, and we're progressing nicely. And in the last number of years, we've kind of plateaued a little bit. So we really need to start looking at, what's going to give us that next level of gain to get us into that range where we want to be. Because right now we're sitting around 40-41 bushels per acre, and so we've still got some room to go there. In a couple areas, we've talked about a few of them already where we think those gains are going to come from. If we look at, establishing those nice, consistent, uniform plant stands, fertility is a big one, I think, where there's some gains to be made there. We've seen fertility rates increasing in a lot of areas, but, setting that fertility rate based on a yield target, I think is an area we can focus on. And, weed control, pest management is another big area there as well. And genetics, we just finished talking about clubroot genetics, but there's also, however many other diseases we want to look at genetics for, and yield consideration, lodging, the whole gamut there. So there's a lot of things that, and I guess most importantly, I like to think of when we're looking at that target and how we're going to get there, is that all these things that we're talking about impact each other. We can't just increase our fertility program and expect that it's going to drive that yield if we're dropping the ball maybe on our timely weed removal. We're just not going to capitalize on it. It's a whole interconnected system.
Yeah. Well, and Brian makes a point here, and I'll address it. Having a 50 bushel an acre average yield sounds great, but if it comes at the expense of $8 a bushel canola, is it worth it? And that's why, there's the production side of this, but that's why market access and market development is so critical. Continuing to find new uses for canola to create demand, spur demand, demand with longevity, so that we have buyers for the purchases of that increased supply. All crops fighting this, trying to figure it out, and battling in the global market. And of course, right now we're in a real demand boom when it comes to places like China, as Brian, as you know very, very well. So I think it's kind of those two things working together. But of course, that is a comment that we hear frequently when we talk about increasing yields. It comes up more so in wheat. a lot of times than it does in canola. Hey, Lara had a point here. We're talking about Clubroot, and she says, and do follow up. Don't just assume the variety you chose didn't get infected. Obviously that's a thing with Clubroot, and as well, obviously blackleg, to do those same evaluations and that follow up, right, Warren?
Yeah, absolutely. That's infield scouting is important. And, a clubroot resistant variety doesn't mean that it's never going to see clubroot galls on it. So if that is the case, we still want to be out there doing plant samples or pulling plants, looking for symptoms of those diseases, whether it's blackleg, whether it's clubroot, doing that assessment infield just to make sure that that the genetics we're using are doing what we're asking them to. And if not, then we need to look at, okay, what's our next step going to be?
Yeah. Want to encourage Warren and I are kind of the warm up. We're the prelude to the bigger discussion. Tonight on the agronomists, we've got a great panel. It's going to be a lot of fun. They're going to talk about early establishment of canola as well. And so you got a bit of a taste of it here this afternoon, but tonight Lindsay Smith is going to host a great program with some great clips that I handpicked myself that they're going to cover all of these things and more. It also includes one of Warren's peers, Autumn Barnes from the Canola Council of Canada, will be joining the show tonight as well. So check that out, 8 o'clock Eastern. Yeah, the big show. It's the big show. RealAg in prime time. 8 o'clock Eastern, 6 o'clock Mountain. You can find it at realagriculture.com/live. You can also, of course, find it at these exact same places you're watching this show, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook for Real Agriculture. So please join Lindsay and the guests tonight. They're going to have a lot of fun and really share some laughs and some great insight and your questions, of course. Hey, Warren, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you joining us here. All the best to you, and have a safe seeding season, okay?
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Shaun.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. Don't forget to check out RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM. It's Agronomic Mondays. We got a whole bunch of great discussions dedicated to agronomic issues. Thanks for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live. Chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.